Good morning. My name is Ian Brzezinski. I'm a senior fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security here at the Atlantic Council, and I have the privilege of serving as your moderator for our panel, Transatlantic Missile Defense Architecture, Defining the Right Set, the right threat set, which is in itself a loaded question. Now, missile defense is an established priority of NATO. Since 2005, the alliance has been developing capabilities to defend its forces in the field. At a summit in 2010, it decided to include the protection of European populations and territory as an operational priority. And since then, the alliance and its member states have been investing a great deal in missile defense capability. The United States is putting billions of dollars into the European phase adaptive approach, which has a radar now in Turkey, Aegis ships in the Mediterranean, a site in Romania soon to go online, probably early next year, groundbreaking next year for another Aegis Ashore site in Poland that will kick off phase 3 of EPAA in 2018. Nation states of the alliance are making big investments in missile defense. Norway has decided it will contribute some of its frigates to a transatlantic missile defense capability. Germany is modernizing its air and missile defense capability. Poland recently decided that it wants to attain Patriots, a $5 to $10 billion investment to develop its own first air and missile defense capability. And in a world of proliferating missile defense threats, in a world of proliferating increasingly capable missile threats, these are justified investments. And when you look at the European strategic landscape, you essentially see two fronts when it comes to missile defense. We talked earlier this morning about the Russian front, where a menacing bravado, as Damon Wilson described it, features Russian verbal threats of nuclear targeting against NATO allies, particularly those supporting missile defense capabilities, backed by the modernization of its strategic nuclear missile capability, modernization of its medium-range missile capability, including the deployment of Iskander SS-26 missiles, possibly to Kaliningrad and to Crimea. And to the south, you have Iran and its increasing arsenal of missiles. You have the chaos in Iraq and Syria. And just earlier this year, I believe it was in March, a Scud from Syria landed on Turkish territory. We have a great panel to address the efforts the alliance is undertaking to guard against these threats. To my immediate left, I have Frank Rose, the Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance at the Department of State. He's been in that position since December of 2014. And prior to that, he was serving as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Space and Defense Policy. He brings to this position years in the Pentagon, years on Capitol Hill, where he was a senior professional staff member on the House Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Armed Services Committee. And in fact, we first crossed paths back, I think it was in 2002, 2003, when we traveled together to Europe, to Turkey, actually, to Poland, and to France, rolling out President Bush's vision for transatlantic missile defense built around the GBI, the Ground-Based Interceptor. Next, we have Lieutenant General Fritz Pfluger, a retired general from Germany, who used to serve as the deputy commander of NATO's Allied Air Command in Ramstein. He brings to the table well over 30 years of experience in the German Air Force. He was trained initially as an air defense controller and took on senior commands in the German military. He was a commander of the German Air Force Air Operations Command, commander of the Combined Air Operations Center in Udem. And he's considered one of the preeminent experts on NATO air and missile defense, and we welcome him from Germany. And we have Professor Dr. Mustafa Kibaroglu, the chair of the Political Science and International Relations Department at the Modern Education and Science University, MEF, in Istanbul. In addition to extensive writings on weapons of mass destruction and deterrence, developments in the Middle East, and other challenges facing Turkey's national security policymakers, he spent a fair amount of time in the United States working these issues. He was a postdoc fellow at the Monterey Institute in California. He was a fellow at the Belfer Center in Harvard University. And today, in addition to his university responsibilities, he serves as an advisor to the NATO Center of Excellence on Terrorism in Ankara. And to my far left, but certainly not to ever to my right, since we're both the same party, so to speak, we have Heather Conley, the Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic, and the Director of the Europe Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington. Heather and I first crossed paths in a way. I can see three of us, Mustafa, welcome to the crowd, all met in some way in missile defense back in early 2002, 2003. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State responsible for Northern and Central Europe. She served as Executive Director of the Office of the Chairman of the American Red Cross. And at CSIS, she's running a very aggressive set of programs addressing security, European security developments, doing very interesting scenario work on military contingents in that region. And she's a regular person on some of the more prestigious networks, including CNN, NBC, MSNBC, BBC, PBS, and such. So thank you all for joining us. Frank, we're going to turn to you and get your insight on what's the progress being made and are we addressing the right threat set?
Great. Well, Ian, thanks again for your kind introduction and for having me here today. It's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to address the Atlantic Council Annual Missile Defense Conference and to be alongside so many experts in this important field. Today I would like to focus my remarks on how the Obama administration has defined the ballistic missile threat and how we are cooperating with partners around the world to address this threat. I'll keep my comments brief to maximize our time to more freely engage in a discussion. The 2010 Ballistic Missile Defense Review, or BMDR, makes clear that the United States' missile defenses are focused on defending against limited missile threats to the U.S. homeland and regional missile threats to our deployed forces, allies, and partners throughout the world. The development of ballistic missiles by countries like Iran and North Korea and the proliferation of these systems around the world is what drives our threat assessment. Our deployment of missile defenses is focusing on strengthening the twin U.S. goals of deterrence and assurance. In doing so, they also contribute to international peace and stability and reinforce our non-proliferation aims. At the same time, we have made clear both in our policy and in our capabilities, we have deployed our missile defenses efforts are not intended to affect the strategic balance with Russia or China. As a practical matter, the U.S. experience with missile defense suggests that attempting to develop a comprehensive missile defense system to defend against ballistic missile attack from Russia would be extremely challenging and costly, given the size and sophistication of Russia's strategic missile force and the relatively limited number of missile defense interceptors that would be available to defend against such a large force. It is to address the regional threats from the Middle East and North Korea and to enhance our regional deterrence posture that leads us to cooperate with our allies and partners in deploying missile defense systems and architectures today. For example, I just returned from a trip to the Middle East last night where the United States and the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, member states have committed to develop a region-wide ballistic missile defense capability, including through the development of a ballistic missile early warning system. At the recent U.S. GCC summit, the United States committed to work with the GCC to conduct a study of a GCC-wide missile defense architecture and offered technical assistance in the development of a GCC-wide ballistic missile early warning system. Finally, we agreed to hold a senior leader missile defense tabletop exercise to maximize improved regional ballistic missile defense cooperation. In Europe, we continue to make excellent progress implementing the European Phase Adaptive Approach, or EPAA, which will serve as the U.S. national contribution to NATO's missile defense system. Starting in 2011 with Phase 1, we deployed a missile defense radar in Turkey and began the sustained deployment of an Aegis ballistic missile defense capable ship in the Mediterranean. With NATO's declaration of interim capability in 2012, the radar in Turkey was transitioned to NATO operational control. Additionally, we have been working with Spain to deploy 4 U.S. Aegis BMD-capable ships at the naval facility at Rota, which will allow us to increase our rotational presence in the region and respond to potential crises more quickly. We are on track to complete deployment of an Aegis Ashore site in Romania as part of Phase 2 of the EPAA later this year. When operational, this site, combined with BMD-capable ships in the Mediterranean, will enhance coverage of NATO from short and medium-range ballistic missiles launched from the Middle East. Finally, Phase 3 will involve the construction of an Aegis Ashore site in Poland equipped with the new Standard Missile Block 2A interceptor. President Obama's fiscal year 2006 budget request designates approximately $200 million for the establishment of the site, including construction, which will begin early next year, allowing us to remain on schedule to have the site completed by 2018. The Phase 3 site in Poland, when combined with other EPAA assets, will provide ballistic missile defense coverage of all NATO European territory. In the Asia-Pacific, we are continuing missile defense cooperation through our bilateral alliances and partnerships. I'd highlight that the next generation of the Aegis Missile Defense Interceptor, the Standard Missile Block 2A, which we are co-developing with Japan, just completed a successful flight test earlier this month. We also recently deployed a second missile defense radar to Japan, which will enhance the defense of both the United States and Japan. Finally, over the past 20 years, the United States and NATO have offered Russia various proposals for missile defense cooperation and transparency. Russia declined to accept our proposals. As you're aware, Russia's illegal actions in Ukraine led to the suspension of our dialogue on missile defense cooperation. But prior to that suspension, Russia continued to demand that the United States provided, quote, legally binding guarantees that U.S. missile defenses will not harm or diminish Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent. These guarantees would have been based on criteria which would have limited our missile defenses and undermined our ability to protect ourselves, our deployed forces, and our allies and friends against an evolving and growing ballistic missile threat. The 2010 BMDR is quite clear on our policy. U.S. missile defenses are neither designed nor directed against Russia or China's strategic nuclear forces. However, by the same token, we have also made it clear that we cannot and will not accept legally binding or other constraints that would limit our ability to defend ourselves, our allies, and our partners. The United States will continue to insist on having the flexibility to respond to the evolving ballistic missile threat. Allow me to conclude by emphasizing that U.S. cooperation on missile defense is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Threats are diverse, and so must be our solutions. We tailor our unique sets of capabilities to fit with each regional goal, with each regional security environment, stretching from Europe to the Asia-Pacific region. And as more actors develop sophisticated ballistic missile capabilities, it is incumbent upon us to take the appropriate steps to defend the U.S. homeland, our deployed forces, and our allies and partners. I can personally attest that our diplomatic engagements the last 6 years have made us and our allies better equipped to meet the threats of today and nimble enough to respond to what threats may lay ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. Let me just ask a quick question, because you brought into a discussion on Europe, the GCC, and your trip to the region last week. Do you envision a linkage between NATO's transatlantic missile defense architecture and that is evolving among the GCC countries?
I would say perhaps. I think our focus right now is getting a series of baseline capabilities online in the Gulf region. But I do not discount the possibility in the future that we could move towards cooperation. For example, you have a number of GCC states, such as the UAE, who have liaison offices at NATO. So we have no plans currently, but possibly that could be a direction we might want to move.
Interesting. Fritz.
I just wanted to comment on your question. I think there is a natural link. If you link the countries that are cooperating in ballistic missile defense, the Gulf Council nations, then Israel, and then NATO Europe, you see a clear link. And in the context of Israel, there is an overlap of the US European Command's ballistic missile defense mission and NATO's missile defense mission.
It's a natural overlap.
Yeah.
But let me push you to go on next, because Frank gave a good update on the progress being made to date on transatlantic missile defense architecture. And in your view, from Germany, from your experience as a NATO commander, in light of the challenges before NATO today, to the east and to the south, is this progress sufficient?
Difficult point, but let me briefly go back into the history of ballistic missile defense in NATO, Ian, and thanks again for the kind introduction. And I really feel back home here in Washington after 2 years of absence. Last time I was here in the area was 2013, leading a seminar on cyber and space in Norfolk for SACT. As already mentioned, ballistic missile defense was adopted at the Lisbon Summit in 2010 as a NATO mission, and it aims to protect NATO European territory, population, and forces against the ballistic missile threat, mainly from the Middle East. There was no particular threat highlighted in the document. The main argument was the growing proliferation which NATO needed to take into account in order to keep its political leverage. And then the interim capability was declared at the Chicago summit in 2012, mainly based on the US European Phased Adaptive Approach Phase 1 capabilities, which continue to be the backbone of ballistic missile defense in NATO Europe. The TPY-2 sensor in Turkey, TOA to NATO are already in peacetime, and an Aegis ship available, and of course NATO's C2 command and control at Ramstein. I would like to underline that ballistic missile defense, as adopted by NATO, is a mission in which 28 should and will and do support each other in that mission, and that it is a mission which demonstrates NATO's shared commitment in that mission. NATO is now approaching the next step in capability development. It was mentioned that the Aegis ashore in Romania will most probably be technically ready at the end of the year. There will be additional ships and enhanced as command and control capabilities available, so that most probably at the next summit, 2016 in Warsaw, we will see initial operating capability be declared. Now let's have a look at the air defense environment as it is today in NATO. NATO performs day-to-day, 24/7, 365, air policing against the non-NATO military threat. NATO fighter aircraft are on alert, available to the NATO Air Defense Commander, and intercepting aircraft, non-NATO military aircraft in international airspace in order to prevent violation of NATO airspace and to preserve the integrity of NATO airspace. And we are doing, as already said, ballistic missile defense under the interim capability. That is command and control exercised by Aircom Ramstein, and command and control also, and this is how ballistic missile defense mission is performed command and control-wise in NATO. The 3 Patriot elements based on the ground in Turkey, augmenting Turkish air defenses against possible ballistic missiles flying into Turkey from Syria. Kahramanmaraş, Adana, the Spanish, Kahramanmaraş, the German Patriot systems, and in Gaziantep, the US Patriot systems.
Except for the last one, which penetrated.
Yeah, as there are only 2 fire units next to those bigger cities, their mission is to prevent the bigger cities against attacks and not to defend Turkish territory in general. There is a change in the air defense environment. Russian long-range activity has increased, but it is still not yet at Cold War levels. There are frequent intercepts in international airspace over Baltics and North Sea, but so far no serious incidents were in the air. The deployment, as already mentioned, of nuclear-capable SS-26 Iskander short-range ballistic missiles into Kaliningrad is, to say the least, irritating quite a few allies, and the modernization of ICBMs, the procurement of 40 Topol-M missiles is also quite irritating. On the other hand, these movements should be seen, as I see it, in the context of the Russian military strategy, which give nuclear weapons a prominent role in compensating for Russia's conventional weaknesses, and which has been the case over the last 10, 15 years, and which are used to intimidate neighboring countries. The Ukrainian crisis definitely was a wake-up call for the alliance. The key question is, has there been a change in paradigm? I don't think so. However, it was reason enough to have a fresh look at the alliance's rapidly available defense capabilities, air, land, and sea capabilities. And you will recall that there was a very high readiness joint task force created, the so-called Spearhead Force, that just trained last week in an exercise in Poland. Politically very important as a reassurance measure for those new NATO members, the Baltic states, Poland, and others. The allies are not yet ready to regard Russia as a threat. And as mentioned, 360-degree coverage for ballistic missile defense for NATO would require massive extension of the sensor network and massive investment in active defense capabilities, lower and upper layer capabilities. NATO ballistic missile defense was designed to protect against the limited regional threat, not a threat from Russia. And an adversary like Russia always outnumbers defensive capabilities. Therefore, I think we should, as I mentioned in my question, we should have always a strategic view in which deterrence, underpinned by capabilities, offensive capabilities, and strategic communications play a significant role. And this includes force protection of, for instance, the VJTF, for Spearhead Force, by ballistic missile defense capabilities capable to defend against short-range ballistic missiles. And final point, as there are some nations considering to buy national ballistic missile defense capabilities, they should keep in mind that the architecture in NATO Europe calls for an integrated system which requires all these systems being integrated into a single system commanded and controlled by one single C2 node at Ramstein. And this is really important to be kept in mind, that those systems, whichever are bought by the nations, are capable of integrating into the system so that the system can continue to function as an integrated system. And a final political point, we should not forget Russia is needed to solve critical issues in NATO Europe's neighborhood, and the clue must be found to reopen the communication channel to Russia. And I leave it as a question mark whether learning from the Cold War times and NATO's double-track decision and the follow-on INF treaty probably could give us a clue how to go ahead. Thank you.
Fritz, thank you very much. Mustafa, let me ask you, because you raised the issue about the Scud dropping into Turkey. Do you feel that does Turkey feel, in your view, is the alliance paying enough attention to the southern threats, the southern missile threats that confront the alliance? And how does that relate to the debate that seems to be going on in the Turkish government over the air and missile defense system it's trying to develop? And here, of course, I'm talking about its consideration of a Chinese air and missile defense system.
Thank you. I believe this is the crux of the matter. But first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation and for the nice introduction. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here to speak to before such a distinguished audience and with this highly distinguished panel. Well, before answering your question, I would like to just give a little bit of background information about how Turkey looked at the missile defense issue over the past couple of decades at least, and maybe not all of people here be familiar with Turkey's geopolitics. Well, to our south, we have failed states, non-states, so-called rogue states. To our north, we have the little green man, as mentioned once. There's this hybrid war going on, and to our east, we have Iran. I don't mention the rest of Turkey's neighborhood because we are, at least for the time being, in relatively better relations with our other neighbors. Well, Turkey has always been, therefore, interested in having elaborate air defense systems, especially starting with the 1991 Gulf War, having seen the not necessarily the numerical performance, but how generals have seen on the screens of their TVs the Patriots shooting some of the incoming missiles. And since then, there was some sort of a rapprochement between, with this particular issue, with respect to this particular issue between Turkey and the United States, with the issue of buying or somehow deploying Patriot anti-ballistic missile systems. And in due course, Turkey, Israel, U.S. have been engaged in some trilateral talks about the possibility of Turkey, U.S. and Israel cooperating in the development of Arrow 2, which has not come to an end, at least from Turkey's perspective. So that was a part of the issue, but also during the 1990s, there was some concern on Turkey's side with respect to the development of U.S. national missile defense because of the adamant opposition of the Russians as well as Chinese, because Russia threatened with not living up to its commitments with respect to the INF because of these missiles threatened Turkey. China threatened with laxing its export controls, which would end up in some of the sensitive material falling into the hands of the states or non-states around Turkey's neighborhood. But Turkey has always been willing to have this or be part of the missile defense system. And in the run-up to the Lisbon summit in 2009, which has been mentioned here, there were some accusations about Turkey of like dragging its feet or blocking a consensus decision within the alliance, which was not the case. Turkey had a number of expectations from the missile defense, NATO shield or the missile shield. Turkey wanted to have this system to cover the entire territory of Turkey. Turkish authorities wanted this. Our former Prime Minister, now President Erdogan, made it a condition for the missile shield not to cover Israel. That was another issue. And also, Turkey was sensitive about naming the names of countries that could be mentioned in the document, which was, as has been mentioned here, it was not the case because Turkey did not want to give Iran the pretext of being mentioned in the text, and therefore a justification for development of its further development of its ballistic missile capabilities. But at the Lisbon summit, problems have been solved, and Turkey agreed to the deployment of the radar system in Kurecik now, which is operational since 2012, concomitantly with the Chicago summit. But this is just part of the issue. And coming to your question, Turkey wants to have a nationwide air defense system, not only against the ballistic missiles, but also against the air power capabilities in the hands of all of its neighbors. Therefore, launch a bid. And in launching that bid, Turkey determined 4 major criteria out of among many others. These 4 criteria were technology transfer, joint investment and long-term partnership, quick delivery, so to speak. This first couple of battalions to be deployed as soon as possible, and also should be affordable and cheap. So out of the bidders, consortium that have been part of the this bid, Chinese company seems to have made the best offer in many respects. And well, the process is still going on. It is not finalized. And I had a chance to talk with the current Undersecretary of Turkish Defense Industries, as well as former Undersecretary, as well as other technical and professional people at the Turkish Undersecretary of Defense Industries. Well, I think the problem lies at sharing technology, because when looked at the issue from, of course, the alliance perspective, one would expect Turkey to choose either the Eurosam or the Patriot, the offer allies at least, and that would probably leave no issue or no concern in the minds of our Western allies that there will be compatibility problem. And also, maybe more important than that, there is serious concern in the West. And when I talk about this with my colleagues and the professionals over the last couple of years, in different fora at the headquarters of NATO, in conference of panels like this, the West is concerned about a serious leakage of sensitive information if and when Turkey deployed the Chinese system all over Turkey. Turkish authorities, technicians, professionals really, are convinced that Turkey can produce a secure interface between the NATO system and the Turkish national system. But this is, after all, a political issue, and I don't think our Turkish authorities are able to convince their Western counterparts that there will be no leakage, even if technologically proven or could be proven by the Turks. So, but what I see in my conversation with the Turkish authorities that this is the very heart of your question. I mean, does Turkey feel confident, or does Turks think that European allies understand Turkey's concern? No, this is the crux of the matter, as I said at the beginning, because most Turks, if not all of them, keep telling me the same thing. Our Western allies do not understand the change in Turkey's security needs, as well as the change in Turkey's abilities, as well as expectations and its future role in the region. And also, they still keep seeing Turkey as it was during the Cold War years, as a client, as a customer, nothing more than that. Well, when this issue comes up, I'm telling my friends, colleagues from Western countries, NATO countries, and tell them to go to where the Turkish former headquarters of the Undersecretary of Defense Industries was, and look at the picture of the former building, which is not there anymore, and also look at the building which has been built over the past several years, and it is maybe 5 times bigger. In terms of staffing, maybe 5-6 times more populated, and in terms of budget, maybe 10 times more, and also in terms of the capacity of the projects, maybe even 10 times bigger. So Turkey aims at becoming, of course, it's a difficult thing, but becoming self-sufficient to the extent possible in terms of deploying its own defensive capability, but also wants to become a key player in the defense industries market. So in that respect, I think the key issue is the technology transfer, which the U.S. authorities are quite seemingly reluctant in terms of meeting Turkey's expectation. Although there are some examples with other countries like Japan, like Sweden, like Spain, Portugal, and other countries are allies. So the expectations, maybe I can give some quotations from my conversation with the authorities and in the next round.
So in short, the Chinese option is still in play, even though it would risk potentially denying Turkey the benefits of NATO's air missile defense architecture.
Well, I think these are two different issues. NATO's air defense architecture will be there because the radar is there, and Turkey will benefit from NATO's architecture. But at the same time, of course, it would be better if Turkey had a nationwide system which would be fully perfectly compatible with the Western or alliance system. So there lies the problem. And as I said, hopefully the issue is not finalized yet, and there are some yards to go. And I think there are negotiations between Turkish and American as well as European producers. And maybe in the next few months, we might see some achievements, some breakthroughs.
Heather, so we've had an American, a German, and a Turkish perspective. And what I'm going to turn to you to see is, to give us your insights, both from your work at CSIS, your time at the State Department, and what are the lessons and what are the implications of managing what are the disparate set of threats among the politics and the diplomacy of NATO when it comes to defending the alliance against missile threats?
Well, Ian, thank you so much. It's great to be with everyone, and thank you all for such great comments. Before we began, we were sort of chatting out in the hallway, and everyone's beginning with, the brief history of, because any debate and discussion that's gone on for 13 years, and this conversation began in 2002, a very different conversation. This was about GBI, long-range U.S. protection. It was a very difficult bilateral conversations with the Polish government, the Czech government. Slowly, we began to NATO-ize, that's sort of my verb, NATO-ize this idea and thinking. And then in 2009, we shifted significantly. Now this was about short and medium term range missiles. This was about protecting Europe and our allies. This was about focusing on the threat to Iran. And the reason I talk about that history is that I think it's important to understand that there was the politics surrounding that shift was pretty horrific. And I think the Obama administration has understood that switch was difficult. But the reason I raise that is that trust was fundamentally broken. That was a pretty significant shift. Then we were trying something else, and then we rebuilt the concept of what we were trying to do on missile defense, and we then continued to NATO-ize it, particularly in the strategic concept in 2010. And you're absolutely right, there was a lot of gnashing of teeth before the Lisbon summit that why couldn't NATO identify the threat that they needed the missile defense protection or ballistic missile defense protection? In hindsight, it may have been prescient, because in some ways we have to retain the flexibility of knowing, because threats change over time. And I want to get back to that in a moment, that the threat picture, I believe, has now changed significantly. But even though we had one plan, 2002, 2003, the plan shifted in 2009, we've been building this capability. It's a core task for NATO. I think we've accomplished an extraordinary amount of rebuilding trust. But the common factor that never went away, even though our telemetry changed and our protection environment changed, we never got rid of the disagreement, as General Wilhelm said, over Russia. Russia never agreed and supported this project. And I would argue it's because while the telemetry may have changed, the geography didn't change. The fact is that infrastructure was being built in the new member states. At that time, they're no longer new. And now we continue to have that challenge. So if I can, let me, and just to clarify one thing, absolutely, the NATO-Russia Council has been suspended due to Crimea, but it was Russia in October of 2013 that unilaterally suspended the missile defense discussions in the NATO-Russia Council. Why October 2013? Well, I think it's apparent Romania broke ground for its plan, and that, again, there's a connection there that we have to understand. So I would argue, to General Wilhelm's point, there actually has been a fundamental change in paradigm in Europe in the security threat. And I think we're struggling to assess that. Now, there are many, I think, in the US government that would disagree with me that it's been a paradigm shift. But and certainly the alliance does not fully agree with that. But I believe we actually need to undertake another BMD review, because what looked like in 2010 is not what it looks like in 2015. I think this has to be a conversation of constant review and assessment. And in some ways, I have to say, I liken this discussion to the same conversation we've been having about the US force posture in Europe today. because everyone's still motoring on the 2010 force posture review. We're taking things out of Europe. We're, some of that's for domestic purposes. We don't need it anymore. So in some ways, the bureaucracy is on autopilot, but the threat environment has changed profoundly. And now we're sort of caught in the middle. Do we leave equipment there? Do we reposition people there? We have to reassess what the current threat environment it is. Certainly not only to the east and Russia, but Iran, whether there's an agreement or not an agreement, their regional picture has deeply disturbing and troubling signs of regional instability. What does that mean for the alliance? So we need to fundamentally rethink this. And I would argue this will be a very uncomfortable conversation with our allies. This assessment and review will be very uncomfortable for exactly what General Wilhelm noted. No one wants to go back to a Cold War setting. No one wants to do this. However, I think we have to in a sober way, reflect on the changes. What do the allies need to do to understand the assessment and to respond to it in a clear and transparent way? Let's also make no mistake, Russia is going to continue to raise the stakes in this area. Exactly, I think absolutely right. The nuclear question is being more pronounced because of conventional challenges, but that makes this even more important that we need to have a NATO conversation about this. And I think Secretary Carter's very important visit to Europe and the NATO defense ministerials meetings yesterday are very foundational in saying we need a new look at the nuclear doctrine. Very controversial, but I think NATO has to make some moves before next year's Warsaw Summit, because we're only, I believe, I hope I'm wrong, but I believe we're only going to see the threat environment grow towards the east. Yes, it's bluster from Russian officials, but I think there's some things on the ground we really need to look at. Quite frankly, NATO is a bit rusty on this. We're reluctant, we're reactive, and I understand, and we should understand that. We need to rethink our posture. We need to get Russia back into the OSCE principles of military exercise notification. We have to get Russia back to that transparency that is absolutely vital to return to the two-track dialogue that General Wilhelm was talking about. But this is a non-negotiable issue. We have to get them back. So I think NATO is in a good place right now, but it has to have an honest discussion among the 28 countries. What is the threat, both from the east and the south? I think there has to be a reassessment on the BMD question. And quite frankly, there may have to be significant new investments. That may be the outcome of the review. But Frank, I think with all due respect, when we talk about the threat, and you're talking about Iran and North Korea, we have to put Russia into that conversation. We don't want to be here, but we have to understand it. And I think the alliance is strong enough and united enough to at least have that discussion. Thanks.
I'm going to ask Heather one question, then I want to turn to Frank and Fritz, because I see you're eager to jump in.
And so the debate begins.
But just to add a touch of clarity to what you're saying, Heather, it sounds like you're saying that we need to rethink NATO's missile defense program to give it extra punch against emerging Russian capabilities, if not current missile capabilities. And then second, that we need to either adjust or complement EPA, the European Phase Adaptive Approach, so it can better address threats to the east.
That said perfectly, absolutely. And as I said, there's not agreement. In fact, I think we're struggling with the assessment ourselves. We're being, a lot of capabilities have been demonstrated. We haven't focused enough on Russia's military modernization program. A lot of it's aspirational. It may not be followed through, but we have to understand it. And then as an alliance, make some calculations on what investments are required and where we need to do that. I think we can't just close our eyes and hope this just gets better tomorrow. I think we have to be mature and sober enough to make an assessment and make a value judgment on what needs to be put into place.
Well, it's interesting. I'm turning to Frank, because Frank, Fritz, and Mustafa all gave very impressive presentations, but there was a slight avoidance, I would say almost, of the threat posed by Russia. Yeah. I mean, listening to what Heather says, she makes a good case. Shouldn't the alliance be spending more time and more explicit time and perhaps directing more resources to the ballistic missile threat posed by Russia in light of its conduct in Eastern Europe, its current deployments, its modernization efforts, and of course its threats.
Well, Ian, what I would say is that at the top level, I agree with Heather, is that given recent events, the alliance needs to take a hard look at its security posture with regards to Russia. And we are doing that internally within the U.S. government and at NATO. Where I would disagree with her a bit, and I talked about that in my opening statement, is based on our previous experience, it would be very difficult technically and from a financial point of view to develop a missile defense capability to defend against Russia's ballistic missiles, number one. Number two, there is no political consensus within the alliance to do that. Number three, our policy remains the same, is U.S. missile defenses and NATO missile defenses are not directed against Russia, nor do they have the technical capability to deal with very advanced Russian systems. But at the top level, I agree, is that there have been changes on the ground. Therefore, we need to adjust appropriately. And again, there is an internal U.S. review looking at this, and NATO is taking account for this as well.
Fritz?
Thank you, Ian. Two comments. Heather, thank you very much for your thoughts, and I'm especially grateful that, at least to my understanding, you picked up some of my thoughts during my presentation. When I said that it is very difficult to develop a 360-degree coverage of ballistic missile defense for NATO Europe, I think that was underpinned by Frank's statement. But I would like to add that in order to, let's say, tell Russia, this is NATO's position, and we want to engage with you on strategic communication and communications, but you, Russia, should understand that there are red lines and that NATO is willing to invest and deploy capabilities that might be required for crisis management. And that includes, and I think I made it clear, that includes protection of the VJTF and the NRF, probably deployed as a crisis management mechanism into the area with ballistic missile defense, air defense capabilities. And when you look at the overall architecture, I come back to a point, Mustafa, that you probably will not like to hear, but I want to underline that NATO, the political leaders in NATO, have given SACEUR the responsibility to protect, in peacetime, alliance territory against an air defense threat. And that includes everything. And what Turkey is doing at the moment, and from an operational commander's position, I do not like it, is trying to build up something nationally underneath that big umbrella. So SACEUR, the operational commander at Ramstein, is given the authority to do air policing against Russian long-range aviation activity. But what about non-NATO military activity around Turkey from other countries? No, this is national business suddenly. So this is not the way as a former deputy commander of an operational command, given that mission, think about it. We think about it as being an integrated mission in which we take care, as given the authority by the political masters, as given by the political masters, that mission to defend. And this includes the integration of all systems, let's say, having an effect in the air or space above NATO territory. And that should be kept in mind. If there is a system not capable to integrate into the overall system, then there are question marks about its overall effectiveness.
Well, a couple of points and then maybe a quick answer to your point. Well, first of all, I agree with Frank in the sense that Russia is such a huge strategic as well as operational capabilities with respect to ballistic missiles that I'm not sure if NATO could, develop such a system to defend and provide 100%, if not 100%, a large, protective capability to the allied countries. So, and that would also run contrary or run against what the United States in the first place, and then Europeans have kept telling the Russians that this is not against you, this is against this and that. So therefore, I don't think NATO should give an image that it's going to transform its missile defense capability that will be effective against Russian capabilities. Heather is right in the sense that we should bring in the Russians in the negotiations back to the table. I think this is an issue that I keep discussing with my Russian colleagues, those who are pretty close to Putin and his former and current advisors and academics who are in his close entourage. They keep telling me that the level of communication between the United States and Russia is almost at zero, that there's much worse than the Cold War times. So I think we should prioritize the threats all around the world, not just in this part of the world. We need Russia when we deal with Iran. We need Russia when we deal with ISIS. We need Russia when we deal with the Koreans, North Koreans, etc. And how can we do this when we are, imposing sanctions, just like the Russians keep telling me, sanctions on Russia and make sanctions even tougher every next day. So this is an issue that we should discuss. And there I have a proposal which is somewhat controversial that I know. And I have written on this subject extensively with respect to the nuclear weapons that are deployed in Europe, U.S. nuclear weapons. And because Russians have always made this a big issue. And 2 or 3 years ago when I was in Poland, I thought I was, not in Poland, but in 21st century, but back in the 1980s during in a conference, as if Cold War was still going on, and they have really attacked the West with respect to the very presence of these weapons that are political weapons. Everybody knows they don't have any military operational usefulness, especially against threats posed by Russia. So maybe withdrawing these missiles would be, perceived as a step forward that would force the Russians to at least do something to reciprocate and get Russia and the U.S. and the West, NATO, closer to talk about threats, emerging threats, and threats that are existing, and solve all this all together. With respect to Turkey's choice, well, we just heard from General Cartwright that countries with this missile defense system, countries can buy their own missile defense system. Of course, therefore, there's room for having a nationwide system which would be compatible with NATO assets. But I think here the bid has been extended several times. Turkey has apparently given its decision, but not a final decision with respect to Chinese defense system. But I think there have been some steps made by Turkish authorities which await some steps to be made by the U.S. or European authorities.
I'm going to be a little bit unfair to Heather because I want to move on to open up questions to other participants. But I want to just quickly go down the list here, starting with Heather, give her an opportunity to respond to some of these points. But with this basic question, what is the missile defense contingency? What is the missile threat contingency the alliance should be most worried about? Because in my view, it's not a contingency involving the total onslaught of Russian military all its missiles, to devastate Berlin, Paris, and such. It's really the limited use of the capabilities that come with ballistic missiles, speed, accuracy, firepower, to shut down certain capabilities along NATO's eastern periphery for a limited land grab. The other contingency that would keep me awake at night, is that loose scud to Turkey's south, because that's where the chaos is, or much of the chaos of the world is today. And we saw a bit of it hit Turkey actually this spring. So it's a limited contingency in which missile defense could actually play a very important role, and I think the alliance has the resources to do it, but just isn't really planning for it. Heather.
Yeah, I think from the threat from Russia, I see it as absolutely the nuclear blackmail question, whether it be a quick seizure of territory and then suing for peace with nuclear weapons. That's obviously the nightmare, worst case scenario. I mean, we've seen rhetorical nuclear blackmail warning the Danish government that if they even inch closer, they're going to be very susceptible. I think this rhetoric is only going to ratchet up. And so we have to decide, oh, it's just bluster, or are they going to be moving components in to be able to make that a reality? This gets back to the need for transparency, notification. We have to get back to the basic rules and to open those channels of communication so we don't misunderstand, because right now it's awfully hard to listen officially to what's going on and not develop a much more robust system. So I agree with you from the East as well as from the South. Two quick questions, and this is the part that just, the frustration mounts, because you're absolutely right. If NATO were to decide, look, we have to now consider Russia as a potential missile threat, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of what the Russian government has been banging on us for a decade plus. This is about us. This is about us. We've always known it's about us. Well, now you've made it about Russia. Yes, I feel frustrated by that, but I don't think that should limit us from recognizing and assessing soberly what that threat actually is. And Frank, I am delighted that there's a parallel review going on both with the U.S. and with NATO. I think, again, if we don't have the courage to even make an honest assessment, then boy, we got bigger problems than what we're talking about. But the problem is there's sometimes a review process that goes on for perpetuity, and I would argue the administration has had a Russian policy review that's gone on, I think we're at 15, 14 months, because we're reviewing because it's really hard to take really tough steps. So the review needs to come to a point where there is a conclusion and then action taken. And I know I say that knowing how incredibly difficult that is, both within the U.S. government and within the alliance. Finally, I just would say one thing, and I understand this is really hard. This is really expensive, and this is just a difficult process to get your arms around. But again, if we can't attack this, it sort of hollows out Article 5. And this is, in some concerns why Poland is sort of creating a more robust national presence. There's a tension there if we say, gosh, we just can't do it. We just can't do it. That leaves some questions about viability down the road. I know that's not what we're talking about, but I'm just saying if we sort of are defeatist about this, then that does send a message that we just, golly, this is a threat too big for us to challenge.
Mustafa, what contingency keeps you up at night?
Well, actually, a ballistic missile coming from Syria tipped with chemical weapons. Because, well, chemical weapons, Paul is here, Paul Volcker, ambassador, can tell you more about the situation, but I think no one can at the moment be 100% sure that there is no a bit of chemicals left in Syria yet. And there was one missile which has penetrated air defense systems. Currently, protecting the big city centers. Anyway, also I would be concerned, I'm still concerned about Iran's always developing missile capabilities because Iran is taking advantage of the situation all the time. Whether it's under stress, whether it's relaxed, its capabilities have always been developed. Just look at 10 years ago and now they are far more difficult to cope with. And with or without NATO in 10, 20 years down the road, Turkey will be here, will be there, neighboring Iran. So Turkish authorities are concerned about Iran's as well as southern neighbors' capabilities.
Thank you. Fritz?
I would definitely agree with Mustafa that for me, the southeastern portion of NATO Europe is the most irritating one because there is a multitude of risks, non-state actors, state actors, everything mixed together in an explosive version. So I'm really concerned with that area. I think Russia's rhetoric and other activities are a point of concern, but more rationally approachable, and I think more rationally also handleable on the political side. But not to be misunderstood, I think we need to be firm as an alliance. Now, Russia needs to understand, I repeat it again, the red lines for the alliance, that Article 5 is definitely something that is maintained by the whole alliance and that the allies will stand together in the defense, and thus, let's say, rhetoric by the incoming chairman of the military committee that the Baltic states will be overrun in 2 days is not a good one. Because I still believe that NATO standing together under Article 5, and I don't have any doubt that NATO will stand together under Article 5, will also tell the Russians, okay, this is an endeavor that goes definitely too far, and we should tell the Russians, if you try to do it, we go beyond the Baltic states. Watch it. So that is, when I said, talking about red lines. So we will not...
Frank. Thank you, Fritz. That's a good hard ending.
He likes it.
I would say, from my perspective, the biggest concern is on NATO's southeastern flank. You have Iran, which has the largest inventory of ballistic missiles in the Middle East. They are continuing to develop and deploy these capabilities, and I would say it is imperative that as long as Iran continues to develop and deploy ballistic missile capabilities, the U.S. will work with our friends and partners in the region to develop effective missile defenses to deny them any advantages from those ballistic missiles, whether they be military or political. Secondly, I think when we think about the East, we also need to remember that NATO and the United States have a broad range of deterrent capabilities. And I'll come back to the point I made earlier. We need to be very realistic about the technical capabilities of our missile defense systems, number one. And two, we have to, as the general mentioned, be very, very cognizant of the political issues, too. You know, for 15 or 20 years, we have been going around saying that our missile defenses are not directed against Russia. If we were all of a sudden to change that policy, that would fundamentally give the Russians a political victory to say, this is about us. We've been telling you all along. So we need to be cognizant of that.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up and just ask people who have questions to just give me us your name, your affiliation, go right to the question so we can save time. Questions?
Who's done?
Ma'am?
Nisu Gören, University of Maryland. My questions are to Assistant Secretary Rose. As you would like to always emphasize, it's going to be phased and adaptive.
Yep.
So what can we expect in recent changes of the threat calculus to increase in the plans? Could we expect to see more THAAD systems, for instance, just because you just came from the Middle East, probably from Qatar? And my second question is about the Black Sea. The Aegis platforms have been to the Black Sea, but the backbone of the system has always been the Eastern Mediterranean. In case of an escalation, or even without an escalation scenario, could we possibly see an Aegis presence in the Black Sea?
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Great question.
Two very good questions. The first part, phased and adaptive, fully agree. We will adapt our systems as the threat evolves. And that's what we have been doing over the past several years. So the bottom line is, as the threat changes, we will have mobile and transportable capabilities that can swing as the threat evolves. With regards to the Black Sea, the United States has no plans to permanently deploy Aegis missile defense capabilities in the Black Sea. We follow the Montreux Convention, which prohibits us from deploying things on a permanent basis. But if contingencies required, we have the capability to send Aegis ballistic missile defense capable ships into the Black Sea. And as you know, there have been several occasions in which we have sent those ships in the Black Sea for other missions, because it's also important to note that our Aegis BMD ships are multi-mission ships. So the bottom line is no plans to permanently deploy Aegis BMD ships in the Black Sea, but should a contingency require it, we can send capabilities there to help defend our allies against the ballistic missile threat.
Mustafa, you want to add to that?
Well, actually, the
Would
important
Turkey
thing
like
is,
to
yeah,
use
because
capability
the Montreux
ships in the Black Sea?
Yeah, I mean, Montreux Convention is something that Turkey pays a lot of attention. And during the 2008 crisis between Georgia and Russia, Turkey had warned its American allies, authorities, is not extending the duration, which is 21 days, and there are also some other limitations with respect to tonnage. So the Montreux Convention is important in the sense that Turkey and Russia are on the same page, and although there are some proposals which have not been officially put on the table by Bulgaria, by Russia, by Romania, but people are concerned if the Montreux Convention is open to discussion, it may not be put back again as something that would represent a consensus situation, which is already sensitive an issue. So therefore, I'm glad to hear from Frank that the U.S. does not have, at least for the foreseeable future, to permanently station naval surface ships in the Black Sea.
Okay. Next. Sir?
Thank you. This is probably for Mr. Rose, but Ms. Conley might have a comment on this as well. It falls into the category of I only know what I read in the newspapers. Mm-hmm. But 2 weeks ago, I read of Secretary of Air Force James's comments while, I believe, at the Paris Air Show about the role of Russia as an evolving threat. 2 mornings ago in this room, we listened to asked Chairman Thornberry talk about a strategy for America, which talked about the emergence of Russia as a threat. Would you be concerned that the focus or applicability of our missile defense capabilities toward Russia, that distinction might be lost in what appears to be a larger trend of talking about Russia as a threat in a larger sense? Thank you.
Well, I do not have the lead for our Russia policy at the State Department, but I'll just repeat the point that I made a little bit earlier. Obviously, there are changes underway. We are looking at the implications of those changes, both internally with the U.S. government, but also with our NATO allies. And again, I think we need to be cognizant when we think about potential responses to Russian aggression that with regards to missile defense, we are very, very, I would say, cognizant of the technical capabilities. And I'll reaffirm the point I make, because I know we have several members of the press here, is that our missile defenses are not directed against Russia, nor do they have the technical capability to deal with the threat from Russia. But what I would also say is there is a recognition that things have changed, and therefore NATO will need to look at this very, very closely, and the United States will do this in close coordination with our NATO allies.
Heather?
I think I'm pretty clear. As long as we don't self-impose limitations on our assessment. I think that's what this comes down to. As much as the politics are really difficult within the alliance, the politics are dreadful with Russia. Let us not limit ourselves on our candidate assessment. And then if there are capability gaps, that we think about ways to augment and fill those gaps, keep those options open.
I just can't help but weighing in is my sense is that the alliance as a whole is limiting itself by not more forcefully or more directly addressing what is a growing Russian missile threat to the region, particularly under circumstances in which they would have limited ambitions, limited strike. And the history of missile defense has been, in the alliance, has been one in which coalitions of the willing within the alliance have driven the missile defense agenda forward. That's clearly the case with the GBI. That was clearly the case with the EPAA. And it'll probably have to be again the case on dealing with the new threat environment we face in Europe. And the fact is that today there are allies who are making significant investments in missile defense against the Russian threat. The Poles are spending $5 to $10 billion on a system that's not designed against the South.
Right.
But let me open up one last question. Sir, in the back there.
Hi, my name is Stephen Wallace. I'd like to, can anyone address the non-U.S. contributions to NATO's
Yeah.
nuclear weapons defense, missile defense system, and in particular, the Dutch decision to upgrade the Smart L radars on their frigates, and whether Germany and Denmark will participate in that program?
Great. No, that's a very good question. Well, for example, at the lower tier level, you have a number of NATO allies who have Patriot PAC-3. For example, Germany, the Netherlands have Patriot PAC-3. Spain has an older version of Patriot PAC-2. So that's a baseline capability. But you correctly note that a number of other allies are looking to make contributions to the NATO missile defense. For example, Denmark is actively looking at potentially upgrading their Smart L radars. Secondly, the Netherlands I believe, has committed to do the same. You know, one of the things when we talk about missile defense cooperation, sometimes we get too obsessed, from my perspective, with the shooters. Just as important as the shooters is having sensor capabilities, and you have a number of NATO allies like the Dutch, like the Danes, who have sensor capabilities. Also, the Spanish with their F-100 frigate have the Aegis radar on board, as do the Norwegians. So I think we're slowly making progress in this area. Is it where the United States would like to see our allies? I think the answer is no. But have we made considerable progress over the past 10 years? I think the answer is yes. As Heather and Ian both mentioned, 10 or 15 years ago, missile defense was a very divisive issue within the alliance. And I would say the efforts of three administrations, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, have really paid dividends. We are not talking about missile defense now as a divisive issue within the alliance, but I think it is a key element of the types of capabilities the alliance needs to deal with the emerging security challenges of the 21st century, and I think that was made very clear in the most recent NATO strategic concept.
Now, before I turn to Fritz, I'd just add, I think actually your administration, your team's done a great job linking those sensors networks together. That certainly didn't happen during the Bush administration, not because we hadn't thought about it, but this is a priority you all brought to the table. And it's just a very simple way for Europeans to make a direct contribution, not just to their own defense, but to the defense of the U.S. homeland. And that's real burden sharing. Fritz?
Only a few sentences in addition to what Frank already said. I would like to mention that NATO is providing the command and control capability with the node at Ramstein, and this command and control capability at the moment is giving the same command and control capability as is existing on the U.S. national side at EUCOM, doing the European Command Air Defense Mission. So that there is no change. And as Frank said, especially the sensor contribution that might become available by the modernization of the Smart L radars on the European frigates by the Netherlands, the Danish, and probably the Germans will contribute greatly to enhancing the sensor network being capable of detecting ballistic missile launches. And further on, there are other contributions like host nations' responsibilities by the Spanish, as mentioned by Frank already. In Rota, they provide the replenishment port facilities that are desperately needed for the Aegis deployed into the Mediterranean, and further other contributions that are possible. And modernization is also at the horizon concerning SAMPT capabilities, etc. And the Dutch and the Germans committed the Patriots already in the interim capability to the ballistic missile defense mission, providing protection defense of the TPY-2 site in Turkey against a short-range ballistic missile threat. So you really see that ballistic missile defense in NATO Europe is a shared commitment, is a mission that is undertaken by 28 nations supporting each other.
I'm going to close by exercising the right for one last question.
Can I make a final remark
Go
about
ahead,
the situation?
But got to be brief because we're tight
very
here.
brief. I hope that Turkey will make choice which will be best for Turkey and best for the alliance. And
I hope you buy Patriot.
Yeah, and
Subtle there.
buying either the Patriot or the Eurosam system, the European or the American, will eliminate not only the technical operational problems, but also this political problem. But trust me, it's not an issue of money. I mean, the Chinese system is 3.4 billion something. European or Patriots around 5 billion. So far, Turkey has spent $6.6 billion for the Syrian refugees in Turkey. So $6.6 billion spent for humanitarian purposes. I mean, almost double the value of the Chinese system. So I believe everyone should understand that Turkey is not bluffing, and Turkey is looking for what is best for itself as well as for its alliance.
I'm going to allow it's a very important point. I'm going to allow our discussants here just with the close, but I want to throw a thought out. It'd be interesting in your reaction. We talked about the contingency to the east and the contingency to the south. The alliance today is debating whether or not to give Sakyur, the commander of NATO, greater authorities to exercise force in defensive ways. Wouldn't one of them, the natural, least provocative authorities to give Sakyur would be to deploy on his own will Allied air defense assets within the alliance's borders to those areas under threat in the face of a particular contingency? That is to move Patriot batteries from Germany, from the Netherlands, from Greece, from Spain. Other air defense capabilities are coming online. Give them that ability to move those assets within the alliance territory. It'd be defensive. It'd be responsive. It's a response capability we don't have today.
Yes, in theory, I think the politics right now make that impossible. But I think it's military leaders need to continue to sensitize NATO's political leadership and exercise how this works, both below threshold events and how we have to exercise, political leaders have to exercise this in order to give the military commanders confidence when they see a very rapid situation unfolding. That would be my 2 cents.
Well, back in '91, when Turkey called upon the allies to come and display solidarity against Saddam, people thought it was too little, too late. Back in 2003, February, enactment of Article 4 did not happen because of German-French opposition. But this time, at 12, the Patriot batteries have been deployed from Germany, from Netherlands, and the United States. So for the first time, Turks have become more confident, comparatively speaking, confident about NATO's presence would be assured if and when Turkey would be in trouble.
Interesting. Fritz.
Ian, during the times of the Cold War, it was an authority given to Sakyur, because our defense forces were command forces, and operational command included the capability for Sakyur to deploy the assets given to him for the air defense purposes to where he sees fit. Nowadays, the only capability he has under his direct command is the TPY-2 radar and the air policing forces, but no air defense forces. I think it could be an idea to extend again the authority to Sakyur to deploy air defense assets in accordance with indications and warnings, which are definitely work together in the alliance, so that there is, let's say, the cooperation with the allies within the NATO context, how to assess indications and warnings, and then authorize Sakyur to deploy defensive assets.
Ian, I would just say, as we move towards a potential declaration of NATO initial missile defense capability next year, hopefully at the Warsaw Summit, these are the types of issues that NATO is working through right now. So it is a very important question. We're working those issues right now internally at the alliance, and hopefully by the time of initial operating capability is declared, we will have worked out many of those things like concept of operations as well as rules of engagement.
Great. Well, I'm not going to close with any wise words of wisdom, but what I will say is I left this panel certainly more informed about the progress that's being made in developing a transatlantic missile defense architecture, but a little concerned whether or not we're moving with sufficient haste and determination on that. I want to thank our panelists and and we will reconvene in about 10 minutes. So please grab a cup of coffee. And again, thank you very much.